I was astonished when my fiancée broke up with me, so I kicked her out of my house and returned the ring. With this, where do I even begin? To be honest, I'm still struggling to understand why my ex-fiancée Laura suddenly broke up with me. I believed that our relationship was going well. We did experience some ups and downs, but who doesn't? Correct. We had spent 4 years together. We had planned to get married, and then all of a sudden... Not that term, but you get the idea. We should end our relationship, she says. And why? My work. Yes, you read correctly. My fucking work at the restaurant my family owns. I understand now. My schedule is a little strange. She's been off work for around 3 or 4 hours by the time I get home from my evening job. This isn't news, though. Since day one, she has been aware of this, similar to before we were even engaged. She was aware of my disorganized schedule. I put in late hours at work. Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Tuesdays. From 4:30 until 9 p.m., I'm there. Saturdays and Fridays a bit later. It's not like I'm absent, though. Before my shift began, we had Sundays, a few mornings, and even the majority of Saturdays. Laura started talking about how we don't get to see each other very often, and that I should get a new job because she's sick of waiting for me to come home every night. But I didn't think it was that big of a concern. She starts work at 7:30 a.m. She leaves much earlier than I do, till 6 p.m., and I suppose she didn't enjoy being left alone during that period. I always believed we were making things work, even if it's awful. I even suggested that we collaborate at the restaurant. It seemed like a really good concept to me. We could get together more often. We would have more money saved up for the wedding, and she wouldn't be bored waiting around. However, no. She quickly shot that down, cited her discomfort with working for my parents. Okay, great. All right. In any case, I appreciated that, because I didn't want her to feel uncomfortable or anything. I didn't push it. But every few weeks after that, she continued to bring up my employment. The question was, when will you find something better? Alternatively, I failed to see how this can be sustained. I became irritated because, really, how often do I have to express that I'm okay with my current situation? Working for my family brings me great joy. Although the hours might be lengthy at times, the restaurant has been in the family for many years and is well worth the wait. She just sat me down one evening and said, "Ethan, I can't do this anymore." At first, I assumed she was joking, but she was dead serious. She informed me that she didn't see how we could ever get married if I didn't change careers. I was really taken by surprise. I made an effort to reassure her that we could work things out. She was not having any of it, even if she thought there could be a way to better balance things. "I need more from you," she said. "Whatever it takes, we need to put in more time, effort, and dedication to our future." I assured her of my commitment. We were actually organizing a wedding after all. How much more dedicated can you get then? She said that I didn't give enough thought to her needs, which truly hurt. Excuse me, but in order for us to save money for the future, I've been working late shifts. I'm not neglecting her or going out to parties. I work for us. Apparently that doesn't count for anything, as I had assumed. She then dumped the entire thing. That was a stomach punch. And perhaps we should just be friends. We weren't even fighting. There was no shouting, no major altercation. She was the only one sitting quietly, as if she had spent weeks practicing this exchange in her mind. "Are you serious?" I questioned her directly. "Is my employment the reason you wish to discard all of this?" "It's not just your job," she said with courage. "You don't appear to want to change for us, and that's the problem." I became angry at that point. She was aware of my schedule prior to our engagement, I reminded her. Why in the world would she consent to marry me in the first place if it was such an issue for her? She became defensive and claimed that she believed I would eventually get over it and find something else. Such as? Working hard at a family business is something you need to grow out of. But since when? I won't tell lies. I was deceived. She essentially acknowledged that she had been waiting for me to change into a different person. And she left when it didn't occur. I simply stayed away from her after that chat. I was unable to even gaze at her. The last thing I wanted to do was return home and sit in the same house as someone who no longer wanted to be with me. So I stayed late at work every night. Here's the problem, though. She stayed. As I had assumed, you would start looking for a new place to stay after breaking up with someone, especially if you were engaged. Not at all. She continued to act as though nothing had changed. as if we had just moved in together or something. She was always there when I got home, lounging on the couch and watching TV as if nothing had happened. I felt ill from it. To be honest, how could she end our relationship and continue to live with me as if nothing had happened? I eventually told her one evening, "Laura, you need to move out. This isn't working for me, and we're no longer together. Get this too." I appeared like I had two heads when she stared at me. "Are you serious?" she said. "Are you throwing me out?" I said to her, "Yes, I am. We are no longer getting married. What use does it serve to live together then?" By claiming that she had nowhere to go, and that I was being cruel for forcing her to go, she attempted to guilt-trip me. I had just finished at that moment. She could remain with her folks until she worked things out, I assured her. To top it all off, I requested the return of the ring. You believe I might have smacked her. I handed it to her, and I couldn't just ask for it back, she said in a panic. That ring was for our wedding, and since we're not getting married, I want it back, I informed her bluntly. She accused me of being avaricious, said that if I truly loved her, I could purchase another one, and added that attempting to evict her after everything we had gone through was rude. I was unable to even protest at that point. All I wanted was for her to leave. Laura had to move out after I told her so. Things quickly became weird. You would assume that she would have just packed her things and gone. Correct? However, not at all. She lingered as though she was anticipating something. I initially assumed she was simply taking her time and attempting to decide where to go. It's not as if she had no other choices. She had friends she could stay with, and her parents live close by. But she chose to remain. I have to admit that the days following the split were the most unpleasant of my life. In the same house, we were living like strangers. On one side of the room, she would sit. I'd be on the opposite side. And there was only this strange quiet. Being the first to speak was something no one desired. She would be there watching TV or doing her thing when I got home from work. However, this enormous elephant seemed to be seated between us. We didn't want to deal with it either. Then things worsened. One day when I get home, Laura and my mother are seated at the kitchen table. Yes, you read correctly. Mom. It seems that she had summoned my mother without informing me. They are enjoying coffee as I come in, as if nothing is out of the ordinary. I was really perplexed. My mother says, "Ethan, we need to talk," after glancing at me. Even though I was already irritated, I made an effort to remain composed. It's my mother, after all. Laura begins to give me her side of the story as soon as I sit down with her. She claims that she has nowhere to go, and that it's unfair that I'm asking her to move out so quickly after the split. Then, with all due respect, my mother begins to offer that perhaps we might come to an agreement, and that Laura might remain a little while longer while she works things out. It seemed unbelievable to me. Such as, after a moment of staring at them, I said, "Mom, we're not together anymore. Why should I allow her to be here?" It works well with my mom, who is always the peacekeeper. She needs time to come to her senses. You know, getting up and moving isn't simple. I was furious within, but I tried to remain composed. Yes, it's difficult, but we ended our relationship. Why should I have to put up with this when we are no longer a couple? You've had time, I remarked, glancing at Laura. Almost a week has passed. You must go. Naturally, Laura then breaks out in tears and claims that she believed I was superior than this, because she didn't think I would simply throw her away like garbage. She even breaks down in front of my mother, and I think it was an attempt to paint me as the villain. At this moment, my mother tries to defuse the situation by suggesting that Ethan give her a little more time. You two spent a lot of time together. Simply ending situations like this is difficult. What I was hearing was unbelievable. My own mother was siding with Laura. Even though I adore my mother, she did not make this call. This isn't your business, Mom, I informed her bluntly. I'm done with Laura. She must leave. Laura then goes on the ultimate guilt trip. If you truly loved me, you wouldn't be doing this, she adds, staring me in the eyes. I believed you were interested in me. That really got to me, man. Although I didn't want to be the villain in this situation, how long was I allowed to continue? It was she, not me, who put an end to things. She's now attempting to reframe it as though I'm the one acting irrationally. I didn't back down, though. I informed her that, although I do care, we are no longer together. It's not your house, either. You must go on. My mom simply sat there looking very sad, as if I had ruined everything, while Laura rushed out of the room. "I just hope you're doing the right thing," she continued, giving me this look. For a long, that bothered me. Was I being too severe, for example? Did I need to give her more time? However, I then reflected on how she had been prolonging this, attempting to remain in the house, and making me feel uneasy in my own home. I also knew I wasn't at fault. She was only attempting to take advantage of the circumstance to make herself the victim. This was my home and my territory. When I get home the next day, Laura has left. She's not home, but her belongings are still there. I initially felt a great sense of relaxation. I thought perhaps she had finally made the decision to move out, but it was simply a game. She returns late that evening, behaving as if nothing had occurred. She remained silent with me. I simply walked to the bedroom and closed the door. By now, I was finished. This was too much for me to handle any longer. I warned her via text that I would begin the eviction process if she didn't remove her belongings and leave by the end of the week. It may sound harsh, but what else could I have done? I didn't want to live in this strange, chaotic scenario for another week, and she wasn't paying attention to me. "Get this too," she responded to her text. "It's unbelievable how you're acting." At least we could be friends, I thought. However, you're acting as though I'm a complete stranger. It dawned on me then that she would never leave unless I made her. She was attempting to manipulate me into caving, perhaps in the hopes that I would apologize or something, and implore her to remain. I wasn't going to do that, though. Not after all that she had done to me. At last, by the end of the week, Laura began packing her belongings. Every time she moved a box, it was like this huge, dramatic scene. She would huff and puff, acting as though she wanted my sympathy, but I didn't. I didn't want to let her stay because she didn't feel like moving, even though I felt bad that things ended the way they did. Then the ring appeared. The ring. Damn it. I thought that conversation was over, but it wasn't. "I can't believe you're actually asking for the ring back," she says, trying to pull it off once more. "I did care about you, you know." This time, I didn't even argue. I just informed her that we would not be getting married. The wedding ring was for the occasion. No ring, no wedding. She looked at me as if I were the world's biggest jerk, but she finally gave it back. And honestly, when she handed it over, I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders. It felt as though I could finally move on, and the last chapter of our relationship was coming to an end. Now, it's been a few days since she left, and honestly, I feel better than I have in months. Not having her around is strange, but it's also liberating. She doesn't have to try to guilt trip me every 5 seconds, and I don't have to be careful around her. Do I miss her? Yeah, a little, but not enough to go back to that mess. Sometimes things just need to end, and dragging them out only makes it worse. Update 1. So after Laura finally moved out, I thought things would settle down right. Like, we're done. She's gone. I can finally get back to normal. But man, I was wrong. Things got weird real fast. First of all, I didn't even realize how much stuff she had left behind. It was like every room in the house had some random item of hers. I'm talking about clothes, books. Even her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. I wasn't going to touch it at first, but then a couple of days went by and I was like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. So I started packing up her things and putting them in boxes. Figured I'd drop them off at her parents' house or something. Be done with it. But then while I was going through her stuff, I found something that threw me off. I don't even know how to explain it, but I found this notebook she had hidden in one of her drawers. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who snoops through people's stuff, but, I mean, she left it here, right? So I opened it, and it was like this whole diary of complaints about me and our relationship. Stuff like, Ethan never listens to me. He doesn't care about my feelings. Why can't he just get a normal job like other guys? It was like reading a list of everything she hated about me. And I got to be honest, it messed with my head. I know relationships aren't perfect, but seeing all of that written out page after page was rough. I had no idea she felt that way. I thought we had our issues, but I didn't think it was that bad. And the worst part? She wrote about how she'd been thinking about breaking up with me for months, but was just waiting for the right time. Like, what does that even mean? The right time to end someone's life plans? I couldn't believe she was sticking around, pretending everything was fine, when in reality she was already halfway out the door. So after reading all that, I just felt this weird combination of anger and sadness. Like, I knew the relationship was over, but finding that notebook made it so much more real. It wasn't just a breakup because of work schedules. It was like she had been mentally checked out for a long time and I didn't even see it. I sat there for a while, just staring at the pages, trying to figure out if I missed something or if I'd been completely blind this whole time. And then it hit me. She never really wanted to marry me. She just wanted me to be someone I wasn't. She wanted me to quit my job, change my life, and become this ideal version of myself that didn't exist. No wonder she broke up with me. I could never live up to what she wanted. I put the notebook away and tried to distract myself, but it kept eating at me. I couldn't stop thinking about everything she wrote. It was like this nagging voice in the back of my head, reminding me that maybe I wasn't good enough. That's the thing about breakups. They make you question everything. You start overanalyzing every conversation, every argument, every time you said, "I love you," and wonder if any of it meant what you thought it did. A few days later, Laura texts me. I hadn't heard from her since she moved out, and honestly I wasn't expecting to, but her text wasn't what I thought it'd be. She didn't want to check in or talk about the breakup. Not at all. She wanted to come by and pick up a few things. Like, okay, you've already been gone for over a week, and now you want to come back and get your stuff. I agreed, but I told her to give me a heads up before she came over. I didn't want any surprises. The last thing I needed was to walk in and find her there without warning. So she comes over, and it's as awkward as you'd imagine. She barely looked at me when she walked in, just went straight to grabbing her stuff like she couldn't wait to get out of there. I was standing in the living room trying to act normal, but the whole situation felt so off, like we'd shared this life together. We've been planning a wedding, and now it was like she was just a stranger coming to collect her things. But then something weird happened. As she was grabbing her stuff, she stopped and looked at me for the first time in days. We actually made eye contact, and she just stood there like she wanted to say something but couldn't get the words out. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to say something. So I asked, "Is everything okay?" And then she said something I'll never forget. She goes, "I didn't want it to end like this." I didn't know how to respond. What was I supposed to say? "We're already here. It's already over." I just stood there, not knowing what to say. And she looked at me like she was waiting for me to fix everything, but I couldn't. How was I supposed to fix something that had been broken for months, maybe even years, and I didn't even recognize it? She grabbed the last of her stuff and left without saying another word. The door closed, and just like that, she was gone again. It was this odd mix of relief and grief. Like, I was pleased the whole ordeal was finally done. But at the same time, it seemed like this enormous chapter of my life had ended, and I wasn't ready for it. After she departed, I did something I never imagined I'd do. I phoned up a therapist. I know, sounds dramatic, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe I overlooked something important in our connection, or maybe I just wasn't made out for this whole long-term commitment thing. I wasn't sure what to anticipate, but I believed talking to someone outside of the situation could help. Turns out, talking to someone who doesn't know you or your ex is really very useful. The therapist didn't offer me all the answers or anything, but she helped me understand that I wasn't the only one to blame for what occurred. Relationships are two-sided, and as much as I messed up in certain areas, Laura had her role in it too. I wasn't faultless, but I wasn't the villain in this narrative either. One thing that particularly resonated with me from those sessions was the concept that sometimes individuals fall in love with the image of someone, not who they really are. And looking back, I suppose that's what Laura did with me. She wanted me to be this version of myself that didn't exist, and she began to check out when I didn't turn into that person. So here I am, feeling better, a few months later. Better, but not terrific. I still occasionally think about her. And yes, I do wonder what may have been. However, I am also aware that things most likely would have become worse if she had stayed. The fact is that we weren't meant to be together. The lesson, I suppose, is that sometimes things end for a reason. It aches, and it's awful. However, it's preferable than trying something that will never work in the long term. The second update. So I assumed that was it once Laura permanently left. Is that the end of the story? As it happens, things weren't as finished as I had assumed. It wasn't until I began receiving messages from friends we had in common that I realized how many loose ends there were. Yes, that is one of those circumstances. It was sluggish at first. Every now and then, I would receive a text from someone asking how I was doing, which was all right, but then they would make these little remarks. As Laura mentioned, she is having a lot of difficulties. Or have you gotten a message from her? I initially dismissed it. I assumed that folks were only being considerate and attempting to gauge our current situation following the separation. However, after then, the communication's tone began to shift. People were behaving as though I was the one who abruptly threw her out. As I sit here, I wonder if Laura hasn't told anyone that she ended our relationship. Apparently not. The next thing I know, several of her pals are sending me lengthy, guilt-tripping texts. People I hardly know are accusing me of being cold-hearted for forcing her to move out and demanding the return of the ring. Excuse me? She ended our relationship. I wasn't going to continue living with my ex-fiancée and seem like nothing was wrong while she was out there accusing me of being the villain. However, she claims that I am the one who was too indifferent to try to resolve the issue. I'm currently in this strange predicament where she's playing the victim, and I'm perceived as the antagonist of the narrative. The speed at which things may change is quite astounding. I had to start telling people the truth, and each time I did, it was just so draining. For example, why must I even defend myself? After a week or two, I believe that things are finally coming to an end. I began to unwind once I stopped receiving the texts and heard from others regarding Laura. Naturally, though, that was short-lived. My phone buzzes one evening while I'm attempting to relax at home after a hard shift at the restaurant while watching TV. Jenna, Laura's best friend, sent the SMS. Now, I never really got along with Jenna. She had a habit of talking into Laura's ear and giving her instructions. Agitating the pot. You are aware. I knew it wouldn't be good when I saw her name appear on my phone. It's a book, as I discovered when I opened the message. Jenna never stops talking about how Laura is upset and how I should have done more to try to save the relationship because I didn't fight for it. You're meant to work as a team, and you simply gave up on her, she even claimed. I was so furious that I could hardly react. However, I did. I replied to her text, keeping things brief and straightforward. Laura ended our relationship, I said. It was she who requested to go. If someone doesn't want to remain, I won't beg them to. Jenna didn't stop there, of course. In an attempt to guilt-trip me, she kept messaging me about Laura's pain and need for time. And perhaps things might have turned out differently if I had reached out. However, I refused to accept it. I informed her bluntly that we were done. It's finished. Give it up. I didn't hear from her again after that. Meanwhile, for a time. Then one day, when I'm at the restaurant attempting to survive the dinner rush, my mother approaches me with this expression. Moms give you that expression when they have something to say but are unsure of how to express it. It was one of those, indeed. Ethan, I spoke with Laura today. She continues, dragging me aside. I just looked at her, wondering why. Well, she called me, my mother says. Stated that she wanted to check in and apologize for the way things ended. Now, when your ex calls your mom to see how you're doing, I'm not sure about you. That is a serious warning sign. I informed my mother. Look, whether she's sorry or not doesn't matter to me. We're finished. She isn't phoning you for any purpose. I know. But she seemed genuinely distressed. My mom sighed. She said she didn't want things to end this way, and that she now feels like you despise her. Once more, here we go. I had to retell the entire story to my mother, stating that Laura was the one who canceled, that she has been telling others that I expelled her, and that I just want to move on. My mother was clearly conflicted, but she eventually understood. Although she promised to stop getting involved, I must admit that it was annoying that I even had to have that discussion. Then everything began to settle down. Actually, Jenna didn't get back to me. I finally felt like I could move on once Laura stopped phoning my mother. In an attempt to regain some semblance of routine, I even resumed going out for drinks with my pals after work. However, something more occurred right as I believed that things were finally calming down. One of my friends, Mark, pulled me aside when we were at the pub one evening and said, "Hey man, you're not going to like this." But the other day, I ran into Laura. I was with a man. I'll be honest with you now. When he said that, I didn't expect to feel anything, but for some reason, I felt as though I knew we were done. However, she had already moved on after hearing that. It was difficult. Who was Mark? I questioned. He said that although they appeared to be very near, he was unsure. I only needed to hear that. The days that followed were strange. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even though I didn't text Laura or anything, I felt as though this chapter of my life was finally done, not because I wanted her back. Since she was moving on, I suppose I had to follow suit. In retrospect, I see that Laura most likely checked out long before our breakup. For her, it wasn't sudden, which may be why everything seemed so abrupt when it happened. She had been thinking about it, planning it, and by the time she finished, she was almost out the door. It took me some time to come to terms with it. Admitting that someone you cared about quit caring long before you did is difficult. But what do you know? It's for the best in the end. Trying to force it would have only made things worse since we weren't meant to be together. I'm concentrating on me now. I'm not in a rush to go back into the dating scene, and I'm not seeking for a relationship anytime soon. All I'm trying to do is rediscover the joy of the small things, spending time with friends, concentrating on my career, and re-establishing my desired level of living. Regarding Laura, I want the best for her. I do. However, I'm beyond the drama, manipulation, and guilt trips. I'm going on. The third update. I'm finally feeling like I can breathe again after several months. To be honest, I'm just relieved that it's finished since it's been quite the journey. However, I encountered a final curve, just when I believed that everything was behind me. Surprise, I mean. Yes, so something else had to happen, naturally. This is what transpired. One day I was working at the restaurant, going about my daily business, when Tom, one of our regulars, entered. Tom has been frequenting the restaurant for years and is now an elderly man. Very cordial with my family. Anytime he's there, he always talks to my parents. However, he has this strange expression on his face this time. "Hey, Ethan, I saw Laura the other night," he continues, dragging me aside. Right now I'm thinking, well, whatever. People frequently see Laura. What's fresh? Then he gives this small tidbit. "She was with Chris, your cousin." My brain briefly shorted out, "I promise." I'm thinking, what? Chris? No, Chris and I are, after all, family. We were raised together. He would never be spending time with my ex-fiancée. Correct? Tom was dead serious, though. He leaves. Yes, dude. Downtown. They were at that new pub. It seemed really near, if you understand. I was at a loss for words. Although I had some doubts, I also thought, well, this is Laura we're talking about, so who knows? I told Tom I'd look into it later and kind of shrugged it off. But I was seething within. I was unsure of my thoughts. Why would Chris be spending time with Laura, of all people? And why was I not informed? I did what any guy would do, of course. I got right to the point. That evening, I texted Chris to find out what was going on. I said something like, "Hey man, I heard you were out with Laura the other night," as I didn't want to accuse him of anything. What is happening there? He took long to reply, and when he did, his answer was, well, let's just say, not what I had been hoping for. "Yes," he says. "We have been spending some time together. Since I knew it would be awkward doesn't even begin to describe it, I didn't want to tell you. My ex-fiancée thought it was a little odd that my cousin, who is my blood relative, was hanging out with him behind my back. I was furious, really furious. I fired back. "What the heck, dude? You were unable to alert me." He made an effort to downplay it by claiming that they were only friends and that it wasn't a huge problem. Nothing major. Come on, though. We all understand what it means to be friends only, particularly when your cousin and your ex are involved. I told him bluntly that I felt deceived and that I wasn't buying it. He began to backtrack, claiming that he had no intention of it happening and that they had simply run into each other one evening, after which things sort of got out of hand. It seemed like they had been conversing for a few weeks. Weeks. That was something I had to dwell with for a long. How on earth do you ever comprehend such a thing? Laura was no longer the only concern. It has to do with family. Someone with whom I grew up and whom I trusted thought it was cool to begin hanging out with my ex as if nothing were wrong. To be honest, it stung more than I anticipated. Laura herself texted me a few days later. She made no attempt to ease into it. Simply strike me with, "Hello, I've heard that you're angry about Chris and me. Can we have a conversation? I was unwilling to speak with her. I didn't want to listen to her justifications, or anything else she was going to say. However, I also required closure. I had to know why she felt this was okay. I so consented to meet despite my better judgment. When we were still together, we used to frequent this coffee shop, which is where we first met. By the way, that was a bad idea. Too many memories. In any case, she sits down and starts talking about how she didn't intend to upset me, how she and Chris bonded, and how she didn't want our relationship to become strange. I wanted to go, but I sat there trying to remain composed. It's not about you two clicking, I informed her. Respect is at issue. After we broke up, you're now spending time with my cousin. You didn't consider it a potential issue. She told me that she didn't anticipate this happening, because it simply did, and that she wished to avoid causing me harm. However, I didn't believe it. I told her directly, you made a decision. You can't come back into my life and pretend that everything is okay now. There was no progress in the talk. She made an effort to defend it. I refused to accept it, and both of us left feeling much more irritated. At least I was able to express my feelings, even if I didn't feel much better. I banned her number after that. She was no longer someone I wanted to deal with. We also had it out with Chris. A few days later, he tried to make amends by calling me. I didn't hold back, but I let him speak. He betrayed my confidence, I told him. Additionally, you don't simply recover from it. I wasn't ready to forgive him, even though he stated he didn't mean for things to get nasty and apologized. Is it family? There is a line that you should never cross. He also crossed it. Both of them have been people I've avoided ever since. Chris still occasionally texts me, but I haven't replied. I might be able to move past it eventually, but I need room right now. Laura, on the other hand, is permanently gone from my life. To be honest, I have no idea if she is still with Chris, and I don't give a damn. They are free to do what they choose. I'm finished. Taking a look back, the entire experience taught me a lot about people in general, not just about relationships. They go and do something like this after you believe you know them and can trust them. It disrupts your mental state. Ultimately, though, you must look after yourself. Although you have no control over what other people do, you do have influence over how you react to it. And my reaction at the moment is to go, I have my own life to lead and my own objectives to pursue. Furthermore, I'm not going to allow this drama bring me down any longer. Story 2. Gold digger marries my dad 2 years before his death, and now she expects to take over his estate, but she has no clue who really owns it. Alright, so here's the deal. My dad's going into hospice next week, and it's been a mess for a while now. I mean, we all knew it was coming, but it doesn't make it any easier, right? Thing is, the house he's living in with his wife, Sandy, and her 2 daughters, Tina and Beth, isn't even his house. It's mine. I bought it years ago. But you wouldn't know that, by the way they've been acting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind a bit. About 7 years ago, things got rough for my dad after my mom passed away. They'd been together for over 30 years, and when she died, it wrecked him. I mean, it was hard for all of us. But my dad, he fell apart. He lost his job a few months later, couldn't keep up with the rent on their apartment, and got evicted. It was like everything just crumbled at once, and he didn't have anyone else to turn to. I was all he had. So being the only kid in a position to help, I bought him a house. Nothing crazy, just a small place in a quiet older neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe. And more importantly, it gave him a roof over his head when he really needed it. He had his dog, Charlie, too. And honestly, Charlie was like his last connection to my mom. That dog was family to us, you know? It made the whole situation a little easier for him. For the first few years, things were good. Dad was healing slowly, and the house became his little sanctuary. He got back on his feet as much as anyone could after something like that, and Charlie was always there by his side, keeping him company. I'd visit every weekend, and it became our routine. Charlie would wag his tail like crazy whenever I showed up, and we'd hang out in the backyard grilling burgers, catching up, just trying to enjoy life again after everything that had happened. Then Sandy came into the picture. They met through some mutual friends, and before I knew it, they were married. I wasn't against it or anything. I mean, I was happy for my dad if this was what he needed. And Sandy seemed all right at first, you know. She was polite, always had a smile, and she seemed like she genuinely cared about my dad. So when he said she was moving in, I didn't have a problem with it. It's his life, after all. Even if it's technically my house, as long as he was happy, that's all that mattered. But here's where things started, getting a little weird. First, it was just Sandy moving in. Fine. Then, out of nowhere, her daughter Tina shows up with all her stuff, like she's moving in too now. Tina's in her late 20s, a grown adult, so it's not like she's some kid who needs a place to crash for a weekend. No, she's there to stay. I didn't say anything because, again, it's my dad's life, and I wanted to respect that. But still, it was a little strange, right? A few months go by and I start noticing things every time I visit. There's more of Sandy's stuff everywhere. The house, which used to feel like my dad's place, now felt like it was more hers. Whatever. I told myself, Dad's happy. Let it be. But then, just when I thought it couldn't get more crowded, Beth, the younger daughter, moves in. Now it's a full house. Sandy, Tina, Beth, and my dad, all under one roof, and you can imagine how that went. At first, I tried to let it go. I mean, yeah, it was weird seeing my dad's home being slowly taken over by Sandy and her daughters, but what could I do? I'm not going to tell my dad how to live his life, but things started getting worse. The vibe in the house shifted. Suddenly, my dad's opinion didn't seem to matter much anymore. Everything was about what Sandy and her daughters wanted. Things were already going downhill with Sandy and her daughters slowly taking over my dad's house. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get more annoying, we had the whole mess with Charlie. Let me explain something about Charlie. This dog wasn't just a pet. Charlie was family. My mom loved that dog like he was her baby. And after she passed away, Charlie became my dad's emotional support. It was like Charlie was the one thing keeping him grounded after everything that happened. I know some people don't get that, but if you've ever had a dog, you know what I mean. So you can imagine how much it pissed me off when Beth, Sandy's youngest daughter, started complaining about Charlie. Like, really? Charlie was old, harmless, and spent 90% of his day either sleeping or chasing his own tail when he wasn't too tired. But one day, out of the blue, Beth comes up with this whole thing about how Charlie makes her uncomfortable. She said she didn't feel safe with him around. Now, I'm not one to dismiss people's fears, but come on. This was Charlie, not some rabid wolf. The guy was 12 years old, could barely make it up the stairs without needing a break, and was about as dangerous as a pillow. I didn't take it seriously at first. I thought maybe she was just being dramatic, but Sandy, of course, jumped in to back her up, making a whole big deal out of it. She started saying that maybe it was time for Charlie to find a new home, like he was some unwanted furniture that needed to be thrown out. That was my breaking point. I could see the stress it was putting on my dad. He wasn't just being asked to give up a dog. He was being asked to give up the last real connection he had to my mom. It broke my heart to see it. But what could I do? I wasn't living there, and Sandy had pretty much taken over the decision-making in the house. I could tell my dad didn't want to get rid of Charlie, but he was tired. He was dealing with his own health issues, and I guess he didn't have the energy to fight back anymore. So, yeah, I stepped in. I told my dad straight up that Charlie could come live with me. I wasn't going to let Sandy or her daughters bully him into giving up that dog. My dad was relieved, but I could tell it still hurt him. I mean, he didn't want to give up Charlie, but he knew it was the only way to stop the constant arguing in the house. Sandy acted like she was doing him some huge favor by letting me take Charlie in, but I knew better. It wasn't about Charlie. It was about control. She and her daughters wanted to be the ones calling all the shots, and Charlie was just another way to push my dad out of the decision-making process in his own home. From that day on, I started bringing Charlie with me every time I visited, and every single time it was like I was bringing some kind of dangerous animal into the house. Tina and Beth would literally act like Charlie was going to maul them any second. The first time I showed up with him after taking him home, Beth actually screamed when she saw him like she hadn't lived with this dog for the past few years. Sandy tried to play it off, but you could see her rolling her eyes every time I walked in the door with Charlie trotting behind me. It was ridiculous. Charlie would come in, wagging his little tail, barely noticing them, and all they could do was complain about how scary he was. I'd sit with my dad in the backyard, just like we always did, while Charlie lay there in the grass, not bothering anyone. And yet, every time Beth or Tina would peek out the window, give us this disgusted look, and run off like they were avoiding some kind of attack dog. Honestly, I think they just hated that Charlie was still around, because it was a reminder that this was my dad's house, not theirs. Charlie was part of my dad's life, part of my mom's life. And no matter how much they tried to take over, Charlie was a constant reminder that they hadn't completely pushed my dad out yet. But then one day, Sandy finally said what I knew had been coming. She asked me not to bring Charlie around anymore. I was fuming. Why? I asked. Charlie's not doing anything. He just sits there. She tried to sugarcoat it, saying how Beth still felt uncomfortable, and how it was just better if Charlie didn't come over anymore. I could see right through it. This wasn't about Charlie at all. This was about power. She and her daughters had been slowly chipping away at everything that was important to my dad, and now they wanted to get rid of the last thing that connected him to his old life. I was livid, but I didn't want to make things harder for my dad. He was already sick, and the last thing I wanted was to stress him out more. So I told Sandy straight to her face, Charlie stays. He's not hurting anyone. And if you don't like it, then don't come outside when I visit. She didn't like that. Not one bit. But I wasn't backing down. I could tell she wanted to push harder, but I wasn't giving her the chance. From then on, every time I visited, Charlie came with me, and I didn't care what they thought. My dad deserved that much, at least. The tension in the house got worse after that. It was like Sandy and her daughters were just waiting for my dad to be out of the picture so they could fully take over. I could see it in the way they treated him, like he was just some old man taking up space. But as long as Charlie and I were around, they couldn't quite get rid of him entirely. And now, with my dad going into hospice, I can already see the writing on the wall. They think they're going to get the house, that everything's going to belong to them, once he's gone. But they're in for a surprise. This is still my house, and Charlie. He's going to outlast all of them. So with my dad going into hospice soon, I knew time was running out to say goodbye properly. It was something I dreaded, but I couldn't put it off anymore. He wasn't doing well, and I needed to see him, especially since I'd been taking care of Charlie ever since. Sandy and her daughters basically forced him out. I wanted to bring Charlie to see my dad one last time. Let them have their moment before everything went downhill. When I showed up at the house, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were already there. The second I walked in with Charlie by my side, I could feel the tension in the room. You know, when you walk into a place and everyone just stops what they're doing. Yeah, it was like that. The vibe was off, but I didn't care. I was there for my dad, not for them. Tina was the first to say something. She looked at Charlie, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Oh, great. He brought that stupid dog again." She wasn't even trying to hide the attitude. She acted like Charlie was some kind of wild animal. But the truth is, Charlie was so old at this point, he barely moved, unless you coaxed him with a treat or something. But there she was, acting all dramatic, like the dog was going to destroy the house. I took a deep breath and ignored her. I wasn't about to start a fight right then, even though I could feel my blood boiling. I just said, "I'm here to see Dad," and headed straight for his room. I could hear Sandy say something to Beth under her breath as I passed, but I didn't catch all of it. Probably some passive-aggressive comment about me or the dog, but whatever. I didn't have the energy to deal with them. When I got to my dad's room, he was lying in bed, looking frail but still awake. His face lit up when he saw me, and when Charlie trotted in behind me, wagging his tail like crazy. My dad smiled for the first time in weeks. It hit me right then how much my dad had missed Charlie. Charlie immediately jumped up on the bed, which honestly was a struggle for him with how old he was. But he made it. He curled up next to my dad like they hadn't missed a beat. My dad reached over and scratched behind Charlie's ears, just like he used to. For a few minutes, it was like things were normal again, and I could see how much peace it brought my dad to have Charlie there. We didn't talk much at first. It was one of those moments where words aren't really needed, you know? I just sat there with him, Charlie, laying between us, and we stayed like that for a bit. I could tell my dad was weaker than the last time I'd seen him, and it hurt to see him like that. But there was also a kind of relief, at least for those few minutes. He looked happy again. After a while, my dad spoke up. "I've missed this old guy," he said, his voice a little shaky, but still carrying that familiar warmth. "It's good to see him again." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without choking up. I didn't want to show how emotional I was getting, so I just reached over and patted Charlie on the head. We talked for a bit about simple things, memories, stories about Charlie, old family moments from when Mom was still around. It felt good, but it was also bittersweet. The whole time I kept thinking about how this might be the last time I'd ever see my dad. Like this, awake and aware. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around even when you know it's coming. And then, of course, Sandy had to ruin it. I was getting ready to leave when she walked in, not even bothering to knock. She glanced at Charlie, curled up on the bed next to my dad, and immediately looked annoyed. "I thought I asked you not to bring that dog here," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I'd committed some huge crime. I felt the anger bubbling up again, but I stayed calm. "Charlie isn't hurting anyone," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He's here to say goodbye to Dad. You've got a problem with that?" Beth, who had followed her mom into the room, piped up from behind her. "Good riddance," she muttered loud enough for me to hear. "I'm glad we won't have to deal with him after this." That was it. I'd had enough. I stood up trying to keep my cool, but it wasn't easy. "You know what? I don't care what you think about Charlie. He's family, and he's staying here as long as I'm here. If you don't like it, tough." Sandy looked like she wanted to argue, but my dad cut her off. "It's fine," he said quietly. "Let them be." His voice was soft but firm, and Sandy didn't push it any further. I stayed a little while longer after that, mostly to make sure my dad and Charlie had enough time together. But eventually, I had to leave. I knew it was probably the last time I'd bring Charlie over, and I wanted it to end on a good note. As I was walking out, Tina was sitting in the living room scrolling through her phone, and she barely looked up when I passed, but just as I was about to reach the door, she said, "I can't wait until we never have to see that dog again." I stopped in my tracks, turned around, and just stared at her for a second, trying to decide if I was really going to engage. But then I just said, "You won't have to," and walked out. I didn't need to give them any more of my time. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how wrong this all felt. It wasn't just about Charlie. It was about everything. How my dad's house had become something else entirely. How Sandy and her daughters had taken over. How they didn't even seem to care about my dad's condition. It was like they were just waiting for him to die so they could get on with their lives. But the joke's on them. This house isn't theirs. And when the time comes, they're going to find that out the hard way. Update 1. After that last visit with my dad, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around Sandy and her daughters, letting them act like they owned the place while I just stood by. My dad wasn't getting any better, and it was only a matter of time before he was gone. Once that happened, I knew Sandy and her daughters would expect to stay in the house indefinitely, just living there rent-free like they'd been doing for years. I wasn't going to let that happen. But instead of dropping the big bomb on them about the house being mine, I decided to take it step by step. First, I needed to see how they'd react to the idea of paying rent. Maybe, just maybe, they'd show some sign of responsibility and agreed to it. But I wasn't holding my breath. So a few days after that emotional visit with my dad, I went back to the house. I walked in, and as usual, Sandy, Tina, and Beth were all hanging out in the living room, like they didn't have a care in the world. They were watching some reality show on TV, laughing at something, and it honestly made me mad. My dad was in hospice, and here they were, acting like everything was fine. I took a deep breath and walked into the room. Tina glanced up at me, barely acknowledging that I was there while Sandy paused. The TV, clearly annoyed that I was interrupting their precious showtime. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. I didn't want to start this off on the wrong foot, even though I was already feeling frustrated. Sandy raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About what's going to happen after my dad passes." I said I could feel the tension in the room rise instantly. The smiles and laughter disappeared, and suddenly all eyes were on me. Good. They needed to hear this. "I've been thinking about it, and we need to talk about the house," I continued, "specifically about rent." The word rent hung in the air like a grenade waiting to explode. Beth let out an incredulous laugh. "Rent? What are you talking about?" I didn't let her get to me. "Once Dad passes, things are going to change. If you want to keep living here, you're going to have to start paying rent. I've already talked to a lawyer, and we've worked out a fair amount based on the market value of the house." Beth looked at me like I just insulted her entire existence. Tina sat up straight, ready to jump in with some snarky comment, but Sandy beat her to it. "Wait a minute," Sandy said, narrowing her eyes. "Why would we need to pay rent? James wanted us to stay here." I nodded, keeping my voice even. "I get that, but I've been covering the cost of this house for years, and that can't continue after he's gone. You've had a good deal here for a long time, but things are going to have to change. Either you start paying rent, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live." The room went dead quiet. I could see the wheels turning in Sandy's head as she tried to process what I was saying. Tina and Beth looked completely blindsided, like the idea of paying rent had never crossed their minds. Of course it hadn't. Why would it, when they'd been living there for free all this time? Finally, Sandy spoke up, her voice sharp. "This is James's house. He wanted us to stay here. You're not going to charge us rent after everything we've done for him?" I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my cool. "Look, I'm not trying to make this difficult, but the reality is someone has to take care of the expenses, and it's not going to be me anymore. I've already covered everything up until now, but I can't keep doing that after Dad's gone. You either pay rent or you move out. Those are your options." Tina finally jumped in her face, red with anger. "You're unbelievable. We've been living here for years, and now you're trying to make money off us. What kind of person does that to family?" I sighed, feeling the frustration building. "I'm not trying to make money off anyone. I'm trying to make sure things are handled fairly. I've given you plenty of time, and I'm giving you more time now. 3 months after Dad passes. 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. That's more than fair." Beth crossed her arms, glaring at me. "So what? You're just going to throw us out if we don't pay?" "I don't want it to come to that," I said, meeting her glare. "But yeah, if you're not willing to pay rent, then you'll have to leave. I can't keep covering the costs for you." Sandy stood up, then trying to play the victim card. "I can't believe you do this to us. After everything we've done for James, everything we've done for this family, you're just going to kick us out like we're nothing." I shook my head. "I'm not kicking you out. I'm giving you options. But like I said, things are going to change and you need to be ready for that. I'm giving you 3 months to figure it out. That's more than generous." I could see Tina getting ready to say something else, but I was done with the conversation. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't going to stand there and argue with them all day. So before they could pile on more complaints or guilt trips, I turned and headed for the door. As I left the house, I could still hear them talking, probably trying to figure out how to get around this, how to keep living there for free. But I wasn't going to budge. I'd given them their choices: pay rent or move out. And in 3 months they were going to have to face reality. They just didn't know yet that the house wasn't even my dad's to give them. Update 2. It happened faster than I thought. One day my dad was still hanging on, and the next he was gone. Even though I knew it was coming, it still hit me like a ton of bricks. Watching him slip away like that wasn't easy, but at least I knew he was at peace now. It was over for him, and the pain he had been living with for so long was finally gone. But after the funeral, I had to deal with the aftermath. And no surprise. Sandy and her daughters, Tina and Beth, were acting like nothing had changed. It was almost as if they'd been waiting for this moment, expecting everything to fall into place for them, like they were ready to take over now that my dad wasn't around, but they had no idea what was coming. I gave it a few days after the funeral to let things settle down, but I wasn't going to wait too long. The sooner I dealt with this, the better. They were probably expecting to stay in that house forever, free of charge, but I had other plans, so I went over to the house. When I got there, Sandy was in the living room with Tina and Beth sitting around like they owned the place. They were laughing about something on the TV, totally ignoring the fact that my dad had just passed. There was no grief, no sadness, just them living their lives like nothing had happened. I stood in the doorway for a second, just watching them. It was surreal, honestly. How could they be so unaffected by everything? I mean, my dad had just died, and here they were, acting like it was just another day. Finally, I cleared my throat and walked in. Sandy turned to look at me but didn't say anything. Neither did Tina or Beth. They just sat there waiting. I guess they thought I was there to talk about funeral arrangements or whatever. I took a deep breath. "We need to talk about the house." Sandy frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean? We've already talked about this. We're staying here just like James wanted." And there it was, the entitlement I had been expecting. I could feel my anger rising, but I kept my cool. I wasn't going to let them get to me. No, I said, shaking my head. We haven't talked about this. You think you're staying here? But the truth is you're not. This house isn't my dad's. It's mine. I bought it for him after my mom died. And now that he's gone, it goes back to me. The room went dead silent. I could see the shock on Sandy's face, like she had no idea what I was talking about. She blinked a few times before finally saying, "What are you talking about?" "James never told me that. This is our home." I almost laughed. "Yeah, well, he didn't need to tell you. This house was never his to give. I bought it for him to live in after he lost his apartment. But it's been in my name the whole time. And now that he's gone, it's time for you to go too." Tina stood up, looking furious. "You can't just kick us out. We've been living here for years. This is our home now." I turned to her, keeping my voice steady. "No, it's not your home. You've been living here for free, and I've let it slide because of my dad. But now that he's gone, that stops. You either start paying rent, or you leave. You have 3 months to figure it out." They were all stunned. Sandy looked like she was about to cry, but she quickly turned that into anger. "You can't do this to us. James wanted us to stay here." "I'm sorry," I said, although I didn't really mean it. "But that's not how this works. Legally, this is my house, and I'm not going to let you stay here without paying rent. You've been taking advantage of my dad for years, and I'm done letting it happen." Sandy tried to argue, but I wasn't listening anymore. I could feel the tension building in the room, but I wasn't backing down. This was my house, and I had every right to do what I was doing. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," I added, pulling out the paperwork to prove it. "If you don't believe me, here it is in black and white. I own this house, not you and not my dad. I've given you 3 months to figure out what you're going to do after that. If you're not out, I'll have no problem evicting you." Beth was sitting on the couch, staring at the paperwork with her mouth hanging open. "This can't be happening," she muttered, looking at Sandy for some kind of reassurance. But Sandy had nothing. She knew it was over. I could see it in her eyes. She had been banking on this house, thinking they could just stay here forever, rent-free. But now reality was hitting them hard. "You've got to be kidding me," Tina said, pacing around the room. "After everything we've done for James, you're just throwing us out." I almost laughed again. "Everything you've done? You mean disrespecting him, pushing him to get rid of Charlie, and treating him like a guest in his own home? Yeah, real generous of you." They all started talking at once, trying to defend themselves, but I wasn't listening anymore. I'd had enough of their excuses, their entitlement, their complete lack of respect. My dad deserved better, and I wasn't going to let them keep living in this house like they owned it. "I've said what I came to say," I told them, turning toward the door. "You've got 3 months after that. We'll see what happens." As I left, I could hear them still arguing behind me, trying to figure out what they were going to do. But that wasn't my problem anymore. They had spent years living off my dad, off of me, and now it was time for them to deal with the consequences. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I walked out of the house. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I was doing the right thing. I had let them take advantage of the situation for too long, and now it was time to take back what was mine. This house wasn't theirs. It never was. And soon enough, they were going to be out of my life for good. Update 3. So after I told Sandy and her daughters they had to move out or start paying rent, I figured that was the end of it. I mean, what else could they do? I had the law on my side. All the paperwork showing I owned the house, and I gave them more than enough time to figure things out. 3 months was fair, right? Well, apparently Sandy didn't think so because, get this, she tried to sue me. Yeah, Sandy actually went to a lawyer and filed a lawsuit claiming she had a right to stay in the house because she was my dad's wife and had been promised it after he died. When I first heard about it, I almost laughed. I got served the paperwork one afternoon while I was at work, and my first reaction was, "You've got to be kidding me." I mean, what was she thinking? She knew I owned the house. I'd shown her the documents, spoken to her calmly about it, and even gave her more time than most people would to get her life sorted out. But no, apparently that wasn't enough. She decided to take it to court, thinking she'd somehow win. Now, I've never been a fan of going to court. The whole process is just a headache. But at the same time, I wasn't worried. I had my lawyer lined up and ready to go. And I knew we had everything we needed to shut this thing down before it even got off the ground. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. He was calm about it, probably because this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. He looked over the paperwork Sandy filed and was like, "Yeah, this isn't going to go anywhere. They don't have a leg to stand on." But even knowing that, I was still annoyed that I had to deal with this at all. I mean, come on. They had already been living in my house rent-free for years. What more did they want? Anyway, the whole thing dragged on for a couple of months. Sandy was making all these claims about how she was promised the house by my dad, even though there was zero paperwork or proof to back that up. She tried to play the grieving widow card, acting like I was this evil guy kicking her out of her home. But the reality was, she had no legal claim to the house at all during the hearings. I had to sit there and listen to her lawyer try to spin this story about how Sandy and my dad had plans to leave the house to her after he passed, and how she had put so much into making it a home for them. Yeah, sure. What she left out was how she and her daughters had taken over the place, treated my dad like a guest in his own house, and tried to get rid of Charlie, my dad's dog. But of course, none of that came up. I kept my cool through most of it. I knew the judge wasn't buying it, and my lawyer was doing a great job shutting down every claim Sandy's lawyer made. We had all the documents to prove that the house was mine. Title deeds, bank records, everything. So every time they tried to bring up some promise my dad supposedly made, we hit them with cold, hard facts. One of the more ridiculous moments was when Sandy tried to claim she had made improvements to the house, and that she deserved some kind of compensation for that improvements. The house was in the same condition it had been in when I bought it. If anything, it was in worse shape because they hadn't taken care of it properly. My lawyer pointed that out, and the judge shut that argument down real fast. And to make it even better, Sandy's daughters, Tina and Beth, had the nerve to show up in court and act like they were victims in all of this. Tina tried to talk about how they had been living there for years and how it was their home. And I just sat there thinking, you've been living there for free, and now you're trying to act like I owe you something. I wanted to say something, but my lawyer gave me that look that said, let it go. So I stayed quiet. It didn't take long for the judge to make a decision. He basically said what we all knew from the start. Sandy had no claim to the house. There was no will, no written agreement, nothing that showed my dad had ever promised the house to her. And since the house was legally mine, Sandy and her daughters were going to have to move out. I wish I could say I was surprised, but honestly, I wasn't. I knew this was how it would end. The whole lawsuit was just a desperate attempt to hold on to something they never had a right to in the first place. The judge gave them a final deadline, 2 weeks to move out, or the eviction process would start. When we walked out of the courtroom, Sandy wouldn't even look at me. She just stormed off with Tina and Beth trailing behind her, all of them acting like I had done something horrible to them. But I didn't feel bad. I'd given them more time and more chances than they deserved, and they still tried to screw me over. In the end, they didn't have much of a choice. After the court ruling, they packed up and left. I didn't hear from them again after that. No more phone calls, no more texts, nothing. It was like they disappeared. And honestly, I was relieved. The whole thing had been a nightmare. But now it was over. The house was finally mine again, and I didn't have to deal with their drama anymore. Sure, it had been a long, exhausting process, but I came out on top. And Sandy, well, she lost. It didn't matter what promises she thought my dad made. In the end, the law was the law, and she couldn't change that. So, yeah, she tried to sue me and she lost. Now the house is mine and they're gone for good. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted. Story 3. As the eldest child of a middle-class family that has always taken pleasure in being conventional and close-knit, I am a 27-year-old lady. We have always lived in a modest but totally paid-off home in a quiet neighborhood, and my parents own a tiny business, a quaint bakery, that they have operated for more than 20 years. Although I was aware of our lack of wealth as a child, my parents instilled in me the value of diligence and familial devotion. Until recently, I thought I could rely on my family, regardless. However, it appears that loyalty has its boundaries. My grandfather gave me a trust money when he passed away around 5 years ago. Although it's hardly lottery money, it's enough to make a big difference in someone's life if handled properly. The hitch is that, unless it's for particular reasons, like purchasing my first house or going back to school, I won't be able to access it until I age 30. I've been waiting patiently to utilize money to either start my own business or buy a little flat in the city, since I've always been a sensible person. I've been looking forward to it as a safety net and a chance to start something of my own. My 25-year-old brother Tyler recently became engaged to Lauren, a 26-year-old woman from a more affluent family. Although Lauren's charisma and confidence light up a room, I've found that she has a way of pushing boundaries that either makes people admire her or avoid her. Until recently, I was cautiously hopeful that she might become a member of the family. A few months back, it began during a family meal. Lauren brought up my inheritance in her typical sophisticated and vivacious manner. It wasn't nuanced. She asked me what I intended to do with it and said I was fortunate to have something so important waiting for me. I described my thoughts on establishing a company or living in a small flat. To be honest, it seemed weird to discuss my finances so publicly, so I kept it vague. Lauren grinned and remarked, almost in jest, that it would be really beneficial if I utilized the funds to help her and Tyler with their future plans, or to support their impending wedding. Lauren merely looked at me awkwardly, as like she was expecting for me to agree, but Tyler laughed it off. I didn't. My parents immediately intervened, claiming that it was my choice and my money. Lauren, however, persisted in her argument that family funds had to be used for the sake of the entire family. At the time, I dismissed it, but there was something wrong about her tone. Lauren's remarks got more straightforward throughout the course of the following few weeks. At family get-togethers, she began to take me aside and urge me to reevaluate my plans for the trust fund. Helping her and Tyler purchase their ideal home would be a far better use of money, she said. She even presented it as an opportunity for me to make an investment in the future of the family. She didn't seem to get the idea when I initially gently told her no, explaining that I had other intentions and that the trust had certain requirements. To his credit, Tyler apologized on her behalf a few times before he began to say things like, "I understand your perspective," or "You're in a great position to assist." Although there wasn't direct pressure, I felt uneasy nonetheless. However, I was genuinely taken aback by my folks' response when I brought it up. They were reluctant rather than shutting it down completely. My mother even mentioned that Tyler had always had greater financial difficulties and that Lauren simply wanted to feel like she belonged to the family. It dawned on me then, this was not going away without a fight. When Lauren confronted me over a laid-back weekend lunch with just the two of us, it was the last straw. She explicitly requested that I think about giving them a share of the inheritance as a wedding gift. This time, I firmly answered no. She said I was self-centered. She said that I was hoarding funds that may significantly impact Tyler's future. I was so taken aback that I wasn't even sure how to react. Later, Tyler apologized over the phone, but it seemed more like damage control than sincere regret. Lauren had a point, he said, but she didn't mean to come across as overly forceful. I have a nagging suspicion that this is only the beginning. My equilibrium has been upset by my parents' unexpected empathy with Lauren's viewpoint. I'm not sure if they truly agree with her, or if they're just attempting to maintain harmony. In any case, I feel as though I'm being framed as the bad guy in my own family. Little things also began to catch my attention. Relatives have commented on how fortunate I am. Subtle changes in Tyler and Lauren's demeanor in my presence. They seem to be pushing themselves to the limit. I feel like I need to be ready for a battle that I didn't ask for, even though I'm trying to maintain my composure and respect my limits. To be honest, I don't know how much longer I can ignore it. Update 1. Tyler texted me to invite me to lunch a few weeks after the awkward chats with Lauren. It seemed harmless enough, siblings catching up informally. I thought it could be a good time to make things clear. Lauren and Tyler were waiting when I got there. Everyone is grinning. Normal small chat about work, updates on their wedding preparations, and a few jokes about how hectic everything was kicked off the meal. The mood didn't change until dessert was served. Lauren leaned closer and spoke in a beautiful, almost practiced voice. Raised my trust money once more. She didn't skirt the problem this time. She recommended that I give them a portion of the money as a wedding gift. Really, that wasn't a proposal. It was more akin to an anticipation. She also mentioned the significance it would have for the family and how it would demonstrate my support for Tyler's future. Remaining composed, I reiterated that the trust had conditions and that I had other intentions for the funds. Lauren wasn't going to back down, but I believed that would be sufficient. She went on to say that I didn't really need the money at the moment, and that I was hoarding wealth that might benefit everyone. Tyler said that while he saw my point of view, Lauren had a valid argument. He presented it as though I was being irrational for not even thinking about it. I felt as though I had entered a setup, and the remainder of lunch was unpleasant. My parents invited me over for what they termed a family gathering a few days later. My folks were dining with Tyler and Lauren when I arrived. I immediately had the same depressing sensation I experienced after lunch. I was taken aback when my parents, who had previously always respected my boundaries, suggested that I divide the bequest to save needless strife. My father even added that family comes first, and that this may be my way of offering assistance. I was blown away. Although they weren't explicitly asking for it, there was no denying the pressure. Lauren appeared arrogant, as though she had already triumphed. I informed them that I owned the trust fund and that I had specific intentions for it. However, my parents began making excuses for Tyler and Lauren, rather than supporting me. Lauren simply wanted to feel like a member of the family, my mom said, and Tyler had always had it harder financially. It hurt more than I thought the betrayal would. Although I didn't commit to anything as I left the meeting, I knew it wasn't over yet. The days that followed were hectic. Lauren was able to include her extended family in the chaos somehow. I began receiving messages from aunts, uncles, and even distant relatives urging me to support Tyler and Lauren because it was the proper thing to do. It became evident that Lauren had painted me as avaricious and unwilling to provide for her own family. The fact that the money had been given to me for certain reasons and that it wasn't even yet available didn't matter. The story was set. My dearest friend was equally as indignant as I was when I confided in her. Even though she told me I wasn't at fault, the incessant calls and texts from family members didn't go away. I have a very close relative who defended me and even offered to mediate the situation. Lauren swiftly put an end to it, accusing the cousin of putting her nose in inappropriate places. When Tyler contacted me late one night and sounded more frantic than I had ever heard him, things took a turn for the worst. By claiming that the money would make Lauren feel accepted into the family and that it was my opportunity to show him how much I cared, he attempted to guilt-trip me. I declined once again, but I was exhausted from the discussion. I made the decision to speak with a lawyer at that point. I had to be absolutely certain that I was the only person with legal authority to tap the trust fund. The attorney reassured me that I was safe and suggested that I keep a record of everything in case things worsened. However, that feeling of relaxation was fleeting. My parents began to insinuate that if I didn't make concessions, they may emotionally withdraw themselves. Although it wasn't a direct threat, it was obvious what it implied. They presented it as me prioritizing money before family, but they failed to acknowledge that Lauren was the one who started the argument in the first place. Every action I made seemed to exacerbate the situation since I was cornered. Lauren persisted in telling her story to everybody who would listen, portraying Tyler and herself as the victims of my alleged greed. I had the unshakable sensation that things were going to grow worse since the whole thing was getting out of hand. Update 2. Shortly after the family gathering, I learned of something that really shocked me. Lauren had already begun making deposits for an expensive wedding, according to a casual comment made by a mutual acquaintance. She had reserved a posh location, negotiated a costly caterer, and even scheduled a fitting for a designer gown. I found it impressive that she was spending with such assurance, as though she already possessed the money. Then something clicked. Lauren was hoping that I would cave. A few days later, I addressed her in her typical calm manner during a family get-together. Lauren acknowledged that she needed to make snap judgments in order to secure the finest vendors, and that she had thought I would change her mind soon. She even presented it as if she were helping me by making sure it was the year's biggest family gathering. Tyler stepped in to defend her when I pointed out how conceited that was. He explained she didn't mean to go too far and had been under pressure to plan. However, it didn't seem like going too far. It seemed premeditated. When my parents revealed an information I was unaware of, things took a different direction. Over the years, they have been lending Tyler money. They said that because he was beginning a family with Lauren, they felt compelled to help him. Their reluctance to confront him or Lauren was understandable, but it also made me realize how pervasive the favoritism was. My inheritance was no longer the only issue here. There was a pattern. Lauren's next course of action was to go public, at least indirectly. She began sharing ambiguous updates about family, greed, and self-centered relatives on social media. Soon after, I started receiving a ton of messages from distant relatives, many of whom I hadn't spoken to in years. They advised me to assist Tyler and Lauren since it was the appropriate thing to do. I was even labeled ruthless by others. I was destroying the family over money while cleaning. I circled back to my lawyer at this point. She suggested that I remove myself from the problem on both a legal and emotional level. That required keeping track of everything and avoiding family arguments about money. I knew I had to defend myself, even if it seemed like a dramatic move. My best buddy, who was always my sane voice, advised me to go farther. No communication with Lauren and Tyler for some time. I could see her point of view, but I wasn't sure I was prepared for it. Tyler left me a voicemail about this time. His voice broke as he begged me to change my mind, claiming that the family was being destroyed by this whole affair. It was difficult to overlook the underlying guilt trip, even if he presented it as a misunderstanding. Shortly after, my parents agreed with him and accused me of being unyielding and uncompromising. With the exception of a few important individuals who saw through the sham, it seemed like everyone was pulling against me. Then came the most disturbing revelation to yet. My relative informed me that Lauren had been attempting to pry into my financial affairs. Under the pretense of assisting with the family budget, she apparently had been requesting information from Tyler regarding the trust and even attempted to gain access to my bank records. Fortunately, there was no real way for them to enter, but I got shivers just thinking about her going that far. My cousin, who had been surreptitiously monitoring the event, discovered something even more startling. Lauren has a track record of using deception to get money. She had previously been engaged, but that engagement ended badly when her ex-boyfriend found out she had been exploiting him to pay for her lavish lifestyle. With this knowledge in hand, my cousin went up to her, which just made things more dramatic. Accusing my cousin of attempting to turn the family against her, Lauren denied everything. The extended family, meanwhile, began to split into two distinct groups. Some people accepted Lauren's story about me being avaricious and self-centered. Others started to see the wider picture after hearing my side of the tale. With family get-togethers becoming battlefields of hushed confrontations and passive-aggressive remarks, the division further exacerbated the mayhem. I realized I couldn't continue living this way. I began to really contemplate dramatic steps to secure my inheritance and, more significantly, my mental health since the stress was getting to me. If Lauren persisted in her harassing, my attorney advised sending a stop and desist letter. Sometimes the only way to maintain peace is to cut people off, as my best buddy reminded me. I didn't make the choice lightly, but I could see the signs were there, by now. It seemed impossible to turn back after the battle lines were established. The one guy who was coordinating it all didn't appear to have any plans to stop, and my previously close-knit family was now divided. All I could do was pray for some sort of resolution in whatever happened next. Update 3. My lawyer and I agreed it was time to act after weeks of non-stop turmoil. She wrote Lauren an official cease and desist letter, warning her to halt the defamation and harassment efforts. It seemed like the right thing to do, especially since Lauren's actions were getting worse. Her social media writings had grown even more scathing, with nebulous references to treachery and barely disguised charges of egotistical family members ruining relationships. I knew that ignoring it would just give her more confidence, and it was tough to cope with. It seems that the cease and desist struck a chord. Tyler and Lauren threatened to sue me for mental distress and retaliation within days. They claimed they were suffering undue hardship as a result of my reluctance to share the bequest and a court letter. At best, their threats were weak. My attorney reassured me that they lacked a legitimate case. Even yet, the chutzpah was astounding. Previously, my laid-back younger brother, Tyler, was suddenly deeply involved in Lauren's plots. Naturally, my parents were involved once more. They pleaded with me to resolve this amicably, so as not to further shame the family. Right and wrong were not their main concerns. It was about what other people would think of this continuing dispute. They said I ought to make a concession, let everything go, and give Lauren and Tyler what they wanted. It was obvious where their allegiance lay when they refused to admit the hurt Lauren was creating. It wasn't with me either. Lauren intensified her social media shenanigans in the meantime. She began spreading inflated tales about poisonous family members, attempting to spoil her and Tyler's nuptials. Reading between the lines wasn't difficult, and members of our extended family who weren't previously connected began contacting me to inquire about if the messages were about me. It was too much to handle the incessant stream of inquiries and remarks. I then made the decision to completely stop communicating with Lauren and Tyler and block them on all platforms. My cousin, who had supported me through everything, took a major step forward. In the event that things worsened, she volunteered to assist me in obtaining proof for my defense. We looked through screenshots of Lauren's messages, posts, and even brief exchanges from family get-togethers together. Building a case demonstrating Lauren's deceptive practices wasn't difficult. The more we learned, the more I understood how far she would go to achieve her goals. When I learned that Lauren had been spreading rumors at my place of employment, things took a more sinister turn. Someone had been calling around asking intrusive questions about me and my financial situation, a coworker said when she pulled me aside. Making the connection to Lauren didn't take long. Fortunately, my helpful coworker assisted me in gathering resources to deal with possible defamation. It was frustrating, but regrettably not surprising to think that she was attempting to ruin my career. In the midst of all of this, Tyler made a crucial error by inadvertently sharing screenshots of a private conversation with Lauren in a group text with my parents. Her true intentions were made abundantly evident by the messages, one of which openly declared that she wanted to get the bag and that my parents would persuade me to give in. She even made a joke about how she had always been skilled at persuading others to agree with her. The messages were damning. I sent my parents the text right away in the hopes that they would finally realize the truth. They reacted with a mixture of denial and shock. They were hesitant to face Lauren head-on, even though they couldn't deny the evidence. As if to justify her actions, my dad muttered something about how weddings bring out the worst in people. My mom seemed more conflicted, but she still didn't fully side with me. The extended family, however, had a much stronger reaction once the text circulated. Many of them began to rally behind me. Those who had previously been on the fence or believed Lauren's version of events quickly changed their tune. The shift was noticeable, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this battle. Lauren predictably tried to backpedal. She issued what could only be described as a fake apology, filled with vague statements about misunderstandings and getting caught up in the stress of wedding planning. It was clear she wasn't sorry for what she'd done, only for getting caught. I refused to accept her apology, which only seemed to fuel her anger. With my lawyer's advice, I decided to take the final step, filing a restraining order against Lauren. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but her harassment had crossed too many lines. The restraining order not only protected me legally, but also sent a clear message that I wouldn't tolerate her behavior any longer. The fallout from the restraining order was immediate. Lauren's social media posts abruptly stopped, and Tyler seemed to pull back as well. The tension with my parents remained, but the silence from Lauren was a relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, I had some breathing room to start focusing on myself again. Update 4. Even after the restraining order, Lauren refused to back down. Through mutual friends and family grapevines, I kept hearing snippets of her complaints. She claimed that I was ruining her life and tearing the family apart with my stubbornness. Her insistence on framing herself as the victim was exhausting. Every time I thought the situation might calm down, someone would forward me a screenshot of another outburst or passive-aggressive comment she made in a group chat. The breaking point came when Tyler called me directly for the first time in weeks. He issued an ultimatum: either I agree to share the inheritance or he would cut me out of his life. He framed it as a choice between being part of the family or continuing to cause unnecessary drama. It was clear he was under pressure from Lauren, but hearing those words from my brother was still a gut punch. I confronted my parents about the entire situation, laying everything out from Lauren's manipulations to Tyler's ultimatum. For the first time, I directly accused them of enabling Tyler and Lauren's entitlement. Instead of addressing the core issue, they dropped a bombshell of their own. They admitted they'd been struggling financially for a while. The bakery wasn't doing as well as it used to, and they were worried about retirement. They hinted that Tyler and Lauren had been helping them out here and there, which explained why they were so reluctant to stand up to them. It wasn't just favoritism. They were financially dependent on them. Hearing this shifted my perspective on why my parents had been so passive, but it didn't make their behavior any less hurtful. My cousin, who had been my strongest supporter throughout this ordeal, suggested it was time to go. No contact with my immediate family, at least temporarily. She reminded me that I couldn't keep setting myself on fire to keep others warm, especially when they weren't willing to meet me halfway. After a lot of thought, I decided to step back entirely from family events. It wasn't an easy decision, but the constant tension was affecting every aspect of my life. I told my parents that I wouldn't be attending any events for the foreseeable future, and requested them not to contact me unless they were ready to handle the problem seriously. Their reaction was inevitably dramatic, accusing me of abandoning the family, but I stayed steady. Meanwhile, Lauren's social media assaults developed into open defamation. She started posting extensive and utterly manufactured stories about how I had destroyed her wedding plans and refused to help out of sheer spite. A few common acquaintances who weren't aware of the complete issue began to distance themselves from me believing her version of events. My lawyer stepped in again, delivering her a warning regarding defamation. The letter must have rattled her since the posts ceased abruptly after that. Interestingly, I started to perceive fractures in Tyler and Lauren's unified front. Mutual acquaintances intimated that Tyler was beginning to regret how far things had gone, but felt stuck by Lauren's expectations. Around the same time, I learned through the same grapevine that Lauren had a backup plan. She was supposedly preparing to leave Tyler once they were financially established. The story originated from someone who had overheard Lauren chatting at a bridal shower, and while I couldn't corroborate it, it fit with all I known about her thus far. As all this was occurring, my parents slowly began to realize Lauren's true colors. During the few tense talks we had, their tone changed, though they didn't explicitly acknowledge it. They began to doubt some of Lauren's choices and admitted that her actions weren't totally justified. They did not, however, offer an apology or accept responsibility for their handling of the matter. I made the decision to put myself first. In order to deal with the family turmoil and learn how to establish more constructive boundaries going forward, I began therapy. I learned from my therapist that although I couldn't alter my family's behavior, I could limit them access to my life. After feeling like I was always on the defense for months, it felt empowering to regain that control. Unexpectedly, my extended family planned a party and made it plain that Lauren was not welcome. They wished to assist me and disassociate themselves from her harmful influence. I felt like I wasn't fighting this war alone for the first time. It was such a comfort to see those who were most important come together for me. I had established my priorities at the conclusion of it all. My primary emphasis shifted to safeguarding my financial future and emotional well-being. I stopped participating in any drama involving Lauren. Tyler refused to indulge my parents' guilt trips, and I turned to my close friends and extended relatives for support. I was able to breathe again for the first time in a long time. Update 5. Things took a drastic turn a few months after I formally severed my relationship with my parents, Tyler and Lauren. Mutual friends began to hear that Lauren had broken up with Tyler. Anyone who had been watching her conduct wasn't surprised by the news. She apparently began to distance herself from Tyler after recognizing that the inheritance dispute would not be resolved in her favor. Lauren moved out of their shared residence on the pretext that she needed space, and the split took place in private. Tyler was caught off guard. Tyler contacted me shortly after. The tone was different from the one I had become accustomed to throughout the inheritance play, which was aggressive and frantic. Rather, he expressed regret. He said that he had disregarded the warning flags because he wanted their relationship to succeed, and that Lauren had tricked him into siding with her. He appeared sincere in his regrets, but I made it plain that it would take time, work, and respect for my limits to mend any kind of relationship. In the meantime, my parents also started attempting to patch up our strained relationship. They began apologizing for their handling of the matter and admitting that they had allowed Tyler and Lauren to have their entitlement. I was receptive to courteous dialogue, but I maintained clear limits. I was clear that restoring confidence would take time. I decided to finally access my inheritance during this period and begin creating the life I had always dreamed of. Some of the money went into buying my first house, a comfortable flat in the city that seemed like a new beginning. I used the leftover funds to launch a small business that I had been envisioning for years. Although it was a calculated risk, the sense of autonomy and control it offered me made the effort worthwhile. My cousin, who had been my staunchest ally during the tragedy, became even more influential in my life. She guided me through the difficulties of launching my company and urged me to concentrate on the connections that were most important. From getting my first business customer to moving into my new house, we shared in each little accomplishment. Her steadfast assistance served as a reminder that blood is not the only factor that defines a family. Regarding Tyler, the consequences of his connection with Lauren made him face some harsh realities. He started going to therapy in order to deal with his codependency problems and gain a deeper understanding of why he had let Lauren control him for so long. He began to reconstruct his life gradually. Our connection gradually got better. He didn't ask for more than I was prepared to offer and respected my limits. Although it wasn't flawless, it was a positive move. Lauren, however, must deal with the fallout from her behavior. Her social media activity decreased following the defamation and cease and desist warnings. Her reputation had suffered greatly by the time her split with Tyler was made public. She finally erased her accounts completely, and mutual friends stopped interacting with her. Later, I learned that she had relocated to a different city in order to start again, leaving a path of bridges that have burnt. Another significant adjustment was made by my parents. They made the decision to retire and sell their failing bakery. They gave the excuses of stress and a need to make their lives easier, but it was obvious that they were also feeling guilty about the way they had handled the family dispute. They appeared to understand that my limits were strict, even if they occasionally tried to get back in touch. After a while, they formally apologized and admitted how deeply their behavior had wounded me. Even so, I was grateful for the gesture. I chose to put my personal peace first and stayed away. Support remained from the extended family that had come together for me in the height of the turmoil. Without the stress that had characterized previous parties, we started planning additional get-togethers. It gave me a sense of community that I hadn't experienced in a while. Some family members even directly contacted me to express their gratitude for my firm stance and for managing such a difficult circumstance with poise. Re-establishing contact with distant family members who appreciated my fortitude was one of the more surprising results. I was reminded by their words of support and encouragement that conflict need not be the defining characteristic of every family dynamic. After what had seemed like never-ending chaos, it was encouraging to see connections flourish. As my business grew, I became financially independent and felt like I had accomplished something. Every little accomplishment seemed like a win, and the difficulties of being an entrepreneur provided a pleasant diversion from the turmoil in the family. I didn't understand how much I needed the freedom to make my own decisions without being constrained by other people's expectations. When I consider all that has transpired, this event has shown me how much I've changed. I will always remember the lessons I learned about setting boundaries, putting my mental health first, and choosing self-respect above toxic relationships. Even yet, the path to recovery isn't always easy. I've finally reached a point where I can look to the future without being constrained by the past. Story 4. Everything has been going well for me, a 29-year-old lady who is getting married to the love of my life. My 27-year-old fiancé and I have been preparing this wedding for months, and we were both really thrilled about it. Everything was coming together: the caterers, the dress, the location. My family was supportive, and we had even succeeded in getting a few of the more challenging relatives to send out RSVPs. After all the chaos preceding it, I thought things was finally coming together, but that was before I spoke with my dad about the 55 of them. To put it mildly, we've always had a somewhat complex relationship. He has never been an emotional person and was always aloof as a child. He would say that I was like my elder sister, who died when I was 16, and that I would never be able to live up to her memory. The situation just never returned to normal. I didn't know how to attract my dad's attention without feeling like I was replacing her, and he didn't know how to be a parent without her. It's difficult to describe, but it seems like we've never truly agreed. In any case, he reacted strangely when I informed him about the wedding. He seemed content, or he pretended to be one, but it wasn't as exciting as you may have thought. "No, I'm really pleased with you. Or perhaps this is my happiest day ever. More like." He offered a hazy smile, nodded, and continued with his day. Normal dad things. He gave me a call a few weeks before to the wedding. He informed me that I should reserve a seat for the special someone he would be coming. I initially believed he was referring to a new girlfriend, but he actually dropped a bombshell. Someone he had adopted, a late 20s lady, my age. To be honest, I had no idea how to take that in. I had no idea that he had been considering adopting someone. Even though we weren't very close, I felt like I should have known if something similar had occurred. I dismissed the strange feeling. Perhaps it was only a phase. I figured, okay, whatever, because my dad was constantly doing these strange things and then dropping them a few months later. However, things appeared to become stranger the closer the wedding drew together. My father hardly communicated. Radio quiet, no updates, no calls. He was unable to even check in on my big day. That seemed a bit strange to me, but I was too preoccupied with the last-minute preparations to give it much attention. The wedding day then arrived. I was thinking about 1,000 things. It was getting late for the floral arrangements. My bridal party was rushing to organize things as the caterer called me every 5 minutes. There is no sign of my dad, not a single text or phone call. I hadn't heard from him, and the wedding was just hours away. I didn't want to freak out, though. I assured myself that he would arrive. He needed to write. I waited in the back, attempting to collect my thoughts as the ceremony was about to begin. I watched my father enter the room with this woman he had adopted. I went cold. I felt sick to my stomach. However, what transpired next truly affected me. My father went directly to the front of the room where my sister's previous seat had been. The seat reserved for special events belonged to my late sister, the one who had always been in the spotlight and whom I could never measure up to. Since Mom died, the seat my dad had set aside for her at family gatherings had remained vacant. However, he set her down on the seat that day, rather than merely walking to it. The new daughter, as if it didn't matter. What I was seeing was unbelievable. My heart was pounding. What was happening? Did I notice anything? Trying not to cry, I approached my dad, but I was hardly able to talk. "What is this?" I questioned him. "She's sitting there, but why?" He made a straight face as he said, "Now, here is my daughter. She is going to replace you." Never in my life have I felt so caught off guard. My own father was behaving as though I no longer mattered in front of my whole family, as if my own wedding was the one where I didn't belong. My fiancée gave me a wide-eyed stare. She was also taken aback. To be honest, I believe she was hit more severely than I was. "Perhaps we should just cancel the entire affair," she said, as she began to drag me away. There was too much tension in the room. My family, who had been anticipating this day with great anticipation, merely stared in silence. Some were just paralyzed in shock, while others were murmuring. I could sense their bewilderment and the weight of their judgment. It dawned on me then that I wasn't the only one who felt deceived. My father was more than simply a dramatist. He was creating a commotion. He was forcing me to decide between my future and my family, and I had no idea how to respond to that. I was determined to make the wedding happen. I had spent months planning this, but how could I deal with my dad's behavior when the day was so chaotic? I had no idea what to do. One update. I felt I was going crazy when my dad and his new daughter entered the room. My wedding day, which I had spent months preparing for, was becoming a nightmare. All I could do was stand there still while I heard the whispers going on around me. The worst thing? In front of everyone, I had to deal with my dad. I strode over to him since I didn't want this to spoil everything. The uncertainty, the rage. As I got closer to him, everything boiled over. "What is this? You brought her here, but why?" He hardly gave me a glance, as if he was too lazy to engage in meaningful discussion. "I now consider this to be my family." "Oh," he said. "You must come to terms with it." To that, I was at a loss for words. Was he telling the truth? He brought a lady my age to replace me at my own wedding with no trouble at all. He was suddenly behaving as though I should accept it. I persisted in asking him to tell me why. Why, of all days, today? I had spent months preparing for this one event. Why did it have to happen? My dad didn't care, though. He informed me that this new daughter was the solution to the years-long search for closure. She apparently filled the void left by the death of my sister years ago. There was no sense about it. Finalization. By taking in a woman who bore a striking resemblance to my sister, it seemed more like he was attempting to erase the past in some way, to replace her, as if I were no longer important. The new daughter, meantime, was behaving as if nothing were wrong. She continued to call me sweetie, behaving reassuringly as though I was the one who was going overboard. At one point, she even attempted to wrap her arm around me, assuring me that everything would be well. I felt like I was going crazy because of it. As I stood there watching my father desert me, she was assuming the part of the sympathetic, understanding stepdaughter. It seemed unreal. As my family comprehended what was happening, I could sense the tension in the room and the awkward stillness. My grandparents were angry on one side. My mother's side was equally perplexed and unsure of how to respond. The fact that my dad would do anything like this in front of me infuriated them all. On the day that matters most in my life, my dad, however, was very unconcerned. Why was he doing this today? I questioned him again. Why did he have to appear in public with her at my wedding? It was his usual reaction. Simply let it go. It's time for you to come to terms with this, he added. My new family is this. He seemed incapable of even realizing how incorrect this was, as if he was blind to the harm he was doing. I turned to face my fiancée, expecting she would know what to do. Even though she had been my pillar of support during this whole ordeal, she was beginning to doubt everything. Should we just cancel the wedding? She murmured to me. It was like a kick to the belly. I heard her say that. However, she was correct. Given that my own father didn't even respect me, how could we get married? I didn't want all of my hard work to come to an end. I didn't want my future with my fiancé to be destroyed by my dad's behavior. It was becoming apparent, however, that this might be too late to correct. So I did the only thing that came to mind. I made the decision to put off the wedding. As I made the announcement, my heart was racing, and I could see our guests' eyes were disappointed. I could not carry out the ceremony in these conditions, even though they were all waiting for it to start. I needed time to work things out with my fiancé. Making a choice that would come back to haunt us was the last thing I wanted. In the background, I could hear my dad telling everyone that family is the most important thing as I took a step back and tried to take it all in. The wedding didn't matter to him. What this meant to me was of no concern to him. He only cared about this new dynamic he had established. His top priority right now is this new daughter. I had to get out of the room. I was so overwhelmed by my feelings that I was unable to breathe. I was unable to think clearly. Feeling totally lost and alone, I ended up sobbing in the back room. I felt as though my own father could not see me. On the most significant day of my life, the one person who ought to have been there to support me had become a stranger. Officially, the wedding was rescheduled. I was unable to wed my fiancée. We were unable to proceed in these conditions. When my father had shattered any hope of family unity, the chaos he caused in that one moment was enough to make me question everything I had ever known about my family. The questions about my dad's motives, about why he would do this, were too big to ignore. I felt betrayed, but I knew I couldn't make any decisions in the heat of the moment, so I decided to take a step back. I needed time to think about my future, about what I wanted, about what I was willing to accept, and if my dad couldn't respect that, then maybe it was time to cut ties with him. But for now, the wedding was off, and the emotional fallout had only just begun. Update 2. So after postponing the wedding, things didn't exactly calm down. If anything, they got even worse. The whole situation with my dad and his new daughter continued to spiral. It felt like no one really understood how deep this went, and my dad wasn't about to admit he'd done anything wrong. I tried to talk to him again. I needed answers. I wasn't going to let this slide. We needed to have a conversation about what had happened and why. He thought it was okay to show up with her and take my place, but when I sat down with him, he brushed me off again. He kept saying it was all just a misunderstanding, and that I was being too sensitive. It seemed unbelievable to me. Every time I tried to get a straight answer, he just deflected. His new daughter. She was still around, showing up at every family gathering like she had always been a part of the family. I couldn't escape her. She was everywhere, calling me. It's like we had been close for years. She even started doing things that felt like she was trying to replace my late sister. She mimicked her style, wore the same kinds of clothes my sister had worn, and even picked up on the way she carried herself. It was unsettling. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My whole family started picking up on it too. But when I brought this up with my dad, he didn't care. He just kept defending himself, claiming that this was the only way he could move forward. He said he needed to find closure after my sister's death, and that adopting this woman, who, by the way, was my age, was the only thing that made sense to him. He had to fill the gap she left behind, he said. It felt like a slap in the face. My grandparents on both sides were furious. They couldn't understand how my dad could do something so disrespectful to me. How could he bring in someone so close to my age and act like I didn't exist? They were all talking behind his back, wondering what he was thinking, but my dad wasn't hearing it. To him, it was all justified. It didn't matter that he was tearing apart our family's foundation. He was just trying to move on from his grief. The tension in my own relationship with my fiancée was getting worse by the day. She started questioning if I was still the person she thought I was, if I couldn't stand up to my own father. How could we move forward as a couple? It was hard to hear, but I knew she had a point. She was upset with my dad, and honestly, she was starting to feel like she couldn't trust me. It was becoming evident that our relationship was on the line due to my dad's activities. Some family members were on my side expressing their horror at what my dad had done. They realized how terrible it was, but there were others who were more sympathetic to him, who thought I was overreacting, or that I should just appreciate that he was mourning. They couldn't realize that it wasn't only about my dad's pain. It was about respect, limits, and my place in this household. It wasn't only my fiancé who was pressuring me to do something. Some of my friends even offered treatment for me and my dad. They suggested it could help us work through everything. My fiancé was on board with this plan, but when I brought it up to my dad, he disagreed. He stated he didn't need therapy. He didn't think anything was improper with his behavior. He made it plain that he was sticking to his choice and there was nothing to repair. As the days passed by, the scenario with his new daughter just grew more weird. She began to appear at family gatherings dressed just like my sister, speaking the same words, and even imitating her body language. She seemed to be attempting to play the part of my deceased sister. I had the unshakable impression that my dad was attempting to replace her whenever I saw her, and he was doing precisely that, attempting to take my place as well. I began discussing my next course of action with my fiancé more. Should I just leave my dad, or should I keep trying to work things out? The tolerance of my fiancé was wearing thin. She warned me that if my dad continued to treat me disrespectfully, she wasn't sure whether she could marry me. It seemed to be the tipping moment. I didn't know how to change this familial dynamic, but I still wanted to be with her. How could I think she would accept being married into a family that was so fractured and divided? By now, I was aware that I needed to decide. My father had no intention of expressing regret for his actions. He may have apologized, but it was a flimsy one, as though he was saying it to cut the talk short. He maintained that his new daughter was here to stay, even though he claimed he was unaware of how much his actions had affected me. I knew he wasn't going to change. It was up to me to decide whether to defend myself or keep attempting to save my relationship with a man who was obviously unconcerned. I wasn't sure whether I had the strength to permanently remove him from my life, but how could I keep acting as like nothing was wrong when it was so obviously not? I was in this weird limbo while the wedding was still on hold. My fiancé and I were becoming more and more tense with each passing day. I had to decide if it was worth fighting for the family that had already abandoned me, even though I had no idea what the future contained. I knew that whatever choice I made would alter everything. The third update is about the wedding. Officially, it's off. I couldn't continue to act as though nothing was wrong. It was obvious that I would not marry after everything that transpired, with my dad's actions looming large over me like a threatening cloud. His arrival at my wedding with his new daughter wasn't the only surprise. It was all that followed the deception, the manipulation, and the ongoing gaslighting. All of it was too much to overlook. I didn't want the wedding to be called off. I had invested a great deal of money, time, and effort into preparing for this day. However, I couldn't bring myself to follow through after that encounter with my dad. My father and I had a totally broken relationship. Knowing that my father didn't value me, how could I get married? How could I act as though nothing was wrong when it was so obvious? My dad kept acting as if nothing was wrong, even after the wedding was called off. He refused to admit that he had injured others. He felt as though nothing had changed, and he was living in his own universe. He would text and call me, as like nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just completely changed my life. He would either sidestep or act as though I was being theatrical whenever I attempted to address him again. He resisted admitting that his actions were inappropriate, and that he had done irreparable harm by bringing this lady into our family and treating her like my sister. As though that wasn't sufficient, I began to have tense connections with my other family members. When I pointed out how disrespectful my dad's behavior was, some people supported me, while others began to point the finger at me. They argued that I ought to have approached the matter differently and made a greater effort to comprehend my dad's sorrow. Others who backed me and others who agreed with my dad's behavior made me feel as though I was torn between two different universes. However, I wasn't prepared to forgive my dad, since, in the end, it was difficult to deny that he was the one who had caused the greatest harm. To help me deal with all that had transpired, I made the decision to begin therapy. I had to figure out how to handle the aftermath and comprehend why my dad had behaved in that manner. The more I discussed my dad's actions, the more I realized how emotionally manipulative he had always been, even though the therapy sessions did help to some degree. This event wasn't the only one. He ignored me for years, made comparisons to my deceased sister, and never showed me any support. It was a difficult pill to take because I was just now beginning to understand everything fully. However, my fiancée was beginning to doubt everything. In addition to feeling deceived by my father, she was uncertain about whether she could carry on our connection. Since I hadn't confronted my dad more firmly, she no longer felt that she could trust me. She had good reason to doubt everything. I had overlooked the reality that my fiancée's sentiments were equally important, since I was so preoccupied with trying to keep things somewhat normal with my dad. She was beginning to feel that she didn't want to marry into such a rude and divided family. I had no idea what to do. I wanted to work with her, but how could I do that? My dad gave me a family relic in an attempt to distract me from the poisonous conflict that had overtaken my family. I guess that was a sign that he was attempting to put things right, but it felt so insincere. This was not going to be resolved by a token or a piece of jewelry. This had nothing to do with worldly possessions. Respect was at issue. No amount of presents could make up for the contempt he had shown to my fiancée and myself. The heirloom wasn't even something I wanted. I must admit that I was offended. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, it seemed as though he was attempting to purchase my forgiveness. My extended family, meanwhile, was picking sides. While some justified my dad's behavior and said I should be more accepting of his desire for closure, others voiced their disgust at him and understood why he was unhappy. Hearing the same thing over and over again was tiresome. It seemed like no one really understood what I was going through, and all I needed was someone to understand things from my point of view. And the guilt trip came next. My father began to play the victim, accusing me of not sympathizing with his sorrow. I was selfish, he said, for not viewing things his way. I felt like the antagonist, as though I was the source of all the turmoil. However, despite my best efforts, he was unable to comprehend that this had nothing to do with his pain. He insisted that I should be happy, and continued guilt-tripping me about how difficult it was for him to move on. He had discovered a person who restored his sense of completeness. I had lost my sense of what to do. Couples therapy was something my fiancé and I attempted, but it was tense. Both of us were suffering from the conflict between my dad and myself, as well as the pressure from my fiancé to pick between her and my family. I wasn't sure I could ask her to go ahead with the wedding, and she wasn't sure she could. However, I always felt like my dad was still in control, and that I was the one who needed to make all the changes whenever I tried to make a choice. The new daughter was becoming more and more involved in all of this. She kept attending family gatherings, behaving as though she belonged there, gradually assuming the role that my late sister had held. My dad seemed to be wiping my sister's memories and substituting this lady for it. It was eerie. I felt like I was losing ground in the family every day, and I had no idea how to stop it. By now, I was aware that I needed to decide. Did I embrace my dad and his new family, or did I sever our relationship permanently, imperfections and everything? I couldn't continue to be caught between my fiancé and my dad. Something had to give. However, what? The wedding's aftermath turned out to be far worse than I had anticipated. My decision to call off the wedding wasn't the end of the turmoil that day. My whole family was affected, and it seemed like it would never end. Before long, my family had divided into opposing factions as people began chatting and whispering behind my back. Some helped me recognize the wrongness of my dad's behavior. Others, however, took his side and attempted to use his sadness as an excuse for his actions. I found myself stranded in the center of what felt like an endless storm. The situation began to worsen as the weeks passed slowly. After supporting me through all the turmoil, my fiancée finally lost it. She was overwhelmed by the conflict between my family and me, the ongoing worry, and my helplessness to resolve the issue. She told me that this tension was becoming too much for her to handle. She couldn't bear the thought of marrying into a family that had treated me so badly. We parted ways. I've never had to accomplish something as difficult as that. Even now, I still adore her. However, everything changes when your own father treats you as like you are unimportant and substitutes someone else for you. That was too much for the partnership to withstand. This was the most difficult period of my life, even though I had expected it to be the happiest. My father didn't appear to understand the harm he had caused. He attempted to defend his behavior during another private discussion with me. He insisted that this new daughter was filling the void left by my deceased sister, and that he had been grieving for years. He went so far as to say that I should be pleased for him, as he had at last managed to move on. What I was hearing was unbelievable. He seemed to be utterly unaware of how much this was hurting me. He never even thought about the impact his actions were having on my future, relationships, or life. I felt more alone the more he attempted to force this new daughter on me. I was no longer sure of my position. Was I only an afterthought, or did I still have any significance to him? I had the impression that I was being replaced, that it was not me who counted today, but the girl he had adopted. And despite my best efforts to maintain harmony, I couldn't deny that I couldn't live with this. The involvement of this new daughter in the family was also growing. She began turning up for holidays and family gatherings, and each time I saw her, I felt like my position in the family was eroding. The manner she was being handled was more important than her mere presence. Similar to my sister, as if she had been a member of our family from the beginning. Both my mother and stepmother, who were incensed over my dad's behavior, contacted me. They were unable to comprehend how he could bring this lady into our life and act as like she belonged there, and how he could replace me in that way. Both of them wanted to stand by me, but they also didn't want to be caught in the crossfire of my dad's schemes. They realized that confronting him would expose them to the full intensity of his rage, so it was difficult for them as well. My dad eventually consented to treatment after much back and forth. However, it was evident that he was not amenable to change when we went. He continued to view things through that prism, completely enmeshed in his sadness. All I had to do, in his opinion, was accept the new family he had made and move on. But I couldn't just ignore what had happened, no matter how much I tried to explain that. He wouldn't see it. Nothing was fixed by therapy. He seemed only to be going through the motions, with no enthusiasm in putting things right. My relatives and friends had advised me to distance myself from my father. They were baffled by my decision to let things get this far. How come I hadn't decided to go sooner? However, it wasn't that simple. Furthermore, it's not something you do lightly to break off contact with your own father, regardless of how terrible the relationship is. I continued to attempt to save what I could, but it got more and more difficult to keep everything together as the weeks passed. Afterward, I hit my breaking point. I suffered a total emotional meltdown a few weeks later. I couldn't find my way. I was no longer sure whom I could trust. My dad, the one person I believed I could always rely on, was the one who had damaged me the most in our split family. I had a sense of betrayal, loneliness, and isolation. I began to emotionally and physically distance myself from my father. I ceased answering his phone and replying to his texts. I knew I had to. Even though it was the toughest thing I had ever done. I couldn't continue to act as though nothing was wrong when it was obviously not. I needed time away from the mayhem he had created. Time to discover who I was. Fortunately, my mother intervened to assist me in processing everything. She was devastated by my dad's actions and urged me to put my healing first and quit attempting to make things better. Sometimes you simply have to leave to protect yourself, she informed me. I knew she was correct, even if I didn't want to acknowledge it. However, the emotional barrier I was creating between us did not sit well with my dad. He began to become irate with me, saying that I didn't comprehend his sorrow. He even accused me of being self-centered for preventing him from moving on. He seemed to be unaware that it had nothing to do with his pain. It has to do with limits, respect, and my emotional well-being. The new daughter went one step farther, which only made the situation worse. She told me in a message that I should move past it and embrace her as a member of the family. She also alluded to certain novel sibling relationships that she wished for us to accept. For me, that was the last straw. I couldn't keep acting like nothing was wrong, especially because I didn't belong in a family that replaced me so easily. I made up my mind. I had to break off all contact with my dad and his new daughter. Even though it hurt, it seemed like the only option to reconstruct my life and safeguard my mental health. It was the only sensible option, but it wasn't an easy one. I couldn't continue to live with a disrespectful family or to act as though things would just work itself out. I was taking charge of my life for the first time in years, even if it meant separating from the family I had known. Update 5. A few months have passed since I decided to sever my relationship with my father. I know deep down that it was the correct choice, even if the agony hasn't gone away. I wish things had turned out differently, but I had to put my mental well-being and tranquility ahead of clinging to a relationship that never truly supported me. After giving everything some thought, I've come to the conclusion that my dad's actions weren't unusual. I can see now how emotionally aloof he has always been. My late sister's memory always hung over me like a shadow, and even as a youngster, I was always the second most important person. But it wasn't until today that I realized how harmful that was. Even though he was never truly able to give me his love and approval, it seemed like I was constantly attempting to win it. Everything was put into perspective by his activities over the past 3 months. My friends and extended family truly helped me out during the wedding disaster and the fallout. When everything got messed up, they were my lifeline. They told me that killing my father was the correct decision. It's difficult to describe, but it makes a huge difference to have friends who genuinely understand and support you. I felt like I wasn't alone for the first time in a long time. One of the most important aspects of my recovery has been therapy. I've been trying to find my way ahead while dealing with the agony of my dad's treachery. Setting limits with others, especially those who don't respect me, is one of the most important skills I'm learning. I let my father to take advantage of me for years, leading me to believe that I was unworthy of respect or affection. It's liberating for me to discover that I can no longer tolerate that conduct from anyone. I've learned in therapy that I don't need to prove myself to anyone. Just the way I am is sufficient. My dad hasn't contacted me in months. I've decided to stick with my decision to stop communication, even though I worry if he has attempted to get in touch with me in any other way. He hasn't even shown regret. I can't allow him to return to my life until he does. I still find it difficult to believe that my father, who ought to have supported me the most, decided to turn his back on me. However, I am certain that I am doing morally. After everything with my dad and the way the wedding went, my ex-fiancée claims that I don't communicate with him anymore, and that our relationship couldn't last while I was always taking care of her. It wasn't meant to be, and I realize that now. She struggled with my dad's actions on her own, and I don't blame her for wanting to leave a relationship that was so painfully tangled up. It's still hard, even though I can't hang on to what we had. The fact that we have different needs is okay. On a more positive note, I resumed dating. I'm taking my time, but it's been a slow process. But I'm wary. I want to go through my own mental baggage before I bring someone into my life. I've come to the realization that before I can really devote myself to someone else, I must first take care of myself. Since it's a new chapter in my life, I want to make sure I'm emotionally and psychologically prepared before taking things seriously. My dad's new daughter sent me a mail a few weeks ago. By urging me to reconcile with my father and embrace her as a member of the family, she attempted to guilt-trip me. I didn't answer. I can't continue to allow others to try to push me into something for which I'm not prepared. I get the impression that she's attempting to unwelcomely into my life, and in order to cheer her up, I won't act like everything is well. A feeling of calm is beginning to wash over me. I'm concentrating on creating a life independent of my family's approval for the first time in years. I can lead a happy life without my dad's approval. I don't have to keep attempting to mend a relationship that was never really healthy in the first place. Even if it's not always simple, I'm forging my own route. My dad sent me a letter a few weeks ago. In a way, it was an apology, but it seemed more like a desperate attempt to win my forgiveness. He urged me to change my mind and be more forthcoming with him. The mail hasn't been opened by me. Too little. Too late is how it feels. I might read it sometime. However, I don't think I'm prepared to confront it just yet. Nothing, in my opinion, will alter my choice, which is definitive. I've been seeing my mom, stepdad, and other family members a lot lately. They have only been encouraging, and I've come to understand that I'm not the only one going through this. I'm really appreciative to them, since they've assisted in my recovery. I know that I have the affection and support of those who genuinely care about me. Therefore, I no longer need my dad's approval. Still, the burden of the past remains. I hoped that one day my dad would show interest in me, and I spent years attempting to win his affection. One of the most difficult things I've ever had to do is let go of that hope. However, I'm making progress. This experience has taught me a lot, most notably the value of self-respect, setting healthy boundaries, and having the guts to leave unhealthy situations. I'm concentrating on designing the life I desire going forward. Even though I might never have the father I've always wanted, I'm learning how to build my own family with the individuals who genuinely love me, and I think that's plenty. I've discovered that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, and I've learned to love and appreciate myself. I'm prepared for whatever happens next, since this is a fresh